Thank you, Belapi, and thank you, everyone, colleagues who are on this call. Indeed, like Belapi said, we are gathering here tonight to continue reflecting, celebrating, and in some way mourning, the unnecessary death that was visited upon Comrade Thulani. Thulani Maseko, I've known him since his university days from far. But when he completed university, we began interacting and our paths were colliding in a number of spaces. And what's particular about where our paths were meeting, it's that it was always when we were talking human rights, democracy, and constitutionalism. And that is where you'd always find Thulani. So it's not surprising that when you reflect on Thulani's life, you find that in all aspects of his life, he was consistent in being an advocate of human rights, justice, political emancipation, democracy, and constitutionalism. So I'll just give us, maybe examples of how Thulani lived this life up to his last day. Thulani was a lawyer, had his own practice, and his law firm was practically a school for human rights for a number of lawyers. He was always prepared to have lawyers come through his practice to do their apprenticeship or articles, as we call them. And in that space, you'd watch him actually trying to ensure that those lawyers who went through his offices appreciate the human rights-based lawyering approach. So he did that for lawyers who were on their way to being professional attorneys, and he also, reached out to peers in the legal space, lawyers who had their own fully fledged practices, and really tried hard to inculcate this ethic and this consideration for human rights in the way that lawyers carry on their work. So that was Thulani in the law space and as a legal professional. So it's not surprising that whenever he could, he would never miss a chance to intervene when there were injustices that were happening. So when you look at his profile, you'll see how he's represented indigent people for free. He's also gone to court in his own name to challenge the system whenever he felt it was acting ultra vires, and not being respectful to constitutional principles. We've also seen Thulani where he could actually setting up different outfits like the Lawyers for Human Rights, the NCA, the Constitutional Assembly, so many outfits that had one purpose only, and the purpose was to ensure that the conversations, the national conversations around democracy and constitutionalism are carried on, and they are being done in a way that leads to changes in the governance system of the country. So that was Thulani, the lawyer, always prepared to use the law and his skill as a lawyer to represent anything human rights, anything political democracy, and constitutionalism. And that journey took him not just to the local courts, but we saw him going into international spaces. Just a few months ago, maybe 2, actually, he was out in the Gambia doing exactly that at the Commission for Human Rights. So that is how Thulani was. And then when you look at his life and you look at how consistent he was, you are struck by how even within his family, his immediate family, it's apparent that they understood what he stood for, and also they embraced his principle, because he wasn't a forceful person. So he would really work with you to try and make sure that you had a full appreciation of what his mission was about. And his mission in the Swaziland context was to ensure that there is a national dialogue, and the national dialogue is geared towards ushering in a constitutional democracy for the country. So within his family, you'd see, for instance, even his late mom, although she was pained by all, that Thulani had to go through because of his convictions, but she was really supportive. She was very supportive. She would complain about how maybe he should stop writing. If they're arresting him for writing, then maybe he shouldn't be writing anymore. But she was saying that in a very supportive fashion. So that was Thulani. He took all of himself into the space, into the struggle. And just this morning, watching the funeral, I was moved to see his young son actually saluting with a fist, at many points during the funeral procession. And that to me said that is truly Thulani's son, young as he is, 6 years old, but he has an appreciation of, what his father stood for. And I guess even in his very young mind, he could sense that this must be about justice. This must be about saluting my father for the man that he was. And that conviction that Thulani had about, engagement, about dialogue, and about, the reality that, or at least the belief that engagement and dialogue would lead us to a constitutional change in Swaziland, actually saw him engaging even with those who didn't quite like him and those who didn't agree with him. So he just kept going back. He'd go back to government with the same message. He'd go back to the international community, those who have missions in the country and those who are resident in neighboring countries. His mission was to preach, engagement, peaceful engagement and dialogue, so that it takes us to a place where we are all enjoying constitutional democracy, never a violent man. So it makes it so painful that despite all the peaceful, demeanor and means that he used throughout his life to engage even with adversaries, he had to, he had to be killed in the manner that he was, be assassinated actually, in front of his family, in front of his kids, leaving them with an indelible trauma, seeing their father in that space. So it boggles the mind why anyone would give an instruction over TR's life, because if anything, TR has always been a bridge, for peaceful engagement and non-violent engagement, and all he wanted was an inclusive dialogue that would take the country into a constitutional democracy. Maybe I can end there for now.